All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
Most of the anti-feminist women I know who discuss politics have heard it.
Feminists got you your voting rights, so you owe us your loyalty forever.
The problem is, they actually didn't, and we don't. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Prior to the suffragettes' agitation in the UK, there existed a universal suffrage movement making slow progress over time, because a limited set of both sexes could vote, but neither sex had universal voting rights. A similar movement evolved in the areas colonized by the British Empire. Attitudes within these movements evolved as society evolved, resulting in repeated calls to widen the spectrum of people who had the franchise. The suffragettes waded into this environment interested only in women's voting rights after the most recent UK law at the time to reduce economic standards for the franchise used the word men, thereby excluding the upper-class women who were, to that point, accustomed to having those rights. That's correct. Women had voting rights prior to the suffragette movement in Britain. They were just limited to women who met the same economic standards men had to meet in order to have the right to vote. Their response was a massive, violent temper tantrum that included bombing churches, random bombing of publicly used mailboxes, throwing rocks through windows of private businesses, public disruptions, and plotting to kill members of Parliament. They exploited lower-income and minority women's interests with no intention of actually seeing the franchise extended to them. The U.S. suffragettes were less overtly violent, but not less racist or classist. They opposed the 15th Amendment because they could not stomach the idea of black men getting voting rights before white women. This, despite the fact that part of the reason for the 15th Amendment was that many emancipated slaves took up arms and fought in the Civil War. Susan B. Anthony openly claimed white women had it rougher in life than black men did. According to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, "What will we and our daughters suffer if these degraded black men are allowed to have the rights that would make them even worse than our Saxon fathers?" Man-hating and racist, but feminism was always about equality, right? Then there was Anna Howard Shaw, president of the National Woman Suffrage Association, who opposed the 15th Amendment by claiming it would make black men, quote, political superiors of white women. If that's not openly racist enough for you, Mississippi State Senator Belle Kearney flat out said that the enfranchisement of women would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy. How's that dictionary definition working out for you, feminists? Frances Willard, founder of the National Council of Women, compared black people to locusts. Rebecca Ann Latimer Felton, first woman to serve in the Senate, called black men ravening beasts and responded to the possibility of black suffrage predating women's by advocating lynching. Suffragette terrorism and racism seem to have done little more than set back their efforts by convincing the same public and those same lawmakers during the same time that women were not rational enough to be trusted with voting rights, delaying reform rather than achieving it. At best, feminists have taken credit for something otherwise inevitable that they hindered. Rather than a struggle to free women from a system of gendered oppression, their actions were nothing but another example of feminism's gendered approach to genderless issues. Suffragists, on the other hand, used public speaking, handing out leaflets, and talking to people directly to build public support for universal suffrage, with the goal of influencing lawmakers through that public support. They had quite a bit to advocate. When the suffragettes began agitating, about 1 in 4 British men could vote. Meanwhile, there are examples of women voting before the women's suffrage movement. To do so, they had to meet the same qualifications men had to meet, save for one. They couldn't be drafted to fight in wartime. Of course, feminists also fail when it comes to understanding the relationship between men's voting rights and wartime drafting. And that partly explains why so many of them are unaware that suffrage history in the U.S. is not as feminists portray it. As in the UK, U.S. suffragettes began agitating supposedly for voting rights for all women in an environment in which their male countrymen's voting rights were far from universal. And, as in the UK, U.S. suffragettes really didn't mean all women. U.S. suffrage history shows that. For instance, in 1876, the Supreme Court ruled that Native Americans were not even citizens as defined by the 14th Amendment and therefore could not vote. In 1890, they were told they could apply to become naturalized citizens in their own ancestral land. Laws denying citizenship to various Asian immigrants passed in 1882, the Chinese exception, and 1922, Japanese immigrants. In 1919, Native Americans and in 1925, Filipinos were told they could earn citizenship by risking their lives serving in American wars. In some areas, local laws, violent intimidation, and arbitrary literacy tests and poll taxes left minorities and the poor subject to the rule of the American government without representation by officials for or against whom they had the right to vote. The same injustice that sparked the Revolutionary War. Asian Americans did not see their voting rights universally recognized until the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. Native Americans' right to vote was not fully recognized until 1957. It was not until 4 years after the first manned American spaceflight, and 4 years before we put a man on the moon, that the Voting Rights Act passed, protecting the rights of all voters, minorities included. Upper-class white women got the vote in 1920. Impoverished citizens and minority men and women did not truly get theirs until 1965. Until July of 1971, when the 26th Amendment became part of the Constitution, that's a year before I was born, U.S. men aged 18 to 20 were ineligible to vote despite being subject to the draft, a stipulation that had earned other men their voting rights decades earlier. Prior to this, the U.S. used the draft to command young men to fight in 3 major wars: World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War. In the UK, suffragettes used handing out white feathers to shame men and boys into volunteering to fight in 2 of those wars. Feminists are quick to point out that American men's voting rights are not directly tied to selective service registration. That can be called true if you ignore how many men's voting rights were contingent on wartime service, and if you can count on the continued choice of the U.S. government to not exercise the full power of today's laws. Failure to register is a felony crime, with the potential for heavy penalties, including jail time and the loss of voting rights. It's not enforced that way during peacetime, but there is nothing to stop the federal government from changing that during a war. It is disingenuous to try to claim that there's no direct tie there in light of that history, one that dramatically differs from women's pathway to the franchise. From the Revolutionary War to Vietnam, American men fought and died to earn their right to vote. UK men also fought and died at the will of their government, earning at great length recognition of their right to vote. Women got theirs by throwing tantrums. Their ability to do even that relied on the freedom earned and protected by the lives and deaths of their male countrymen, and every time feminists try to use the suffragettes as leverage to demand female loyalty, they forget that. They dishonor and disrespect our forefathers, our fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons, and our male friends, neighbors, and co-workers. What do we owe them for that? Suffrage and suffragettes! Who voted for this topic? Oh wait, that would be me, your host, Hannah Wallen, coming to you live with HBR Talk 59, Facts vs. Feminists, Election Edition. I'm here with that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, and she who must be obeyed, Karen Straughan, to blow up a few feminist myths on the topic. But before we do that, we've elected to subject you to a shill. The social media gulag is ever expanding, which is one reason why we've diversified to multiple platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and audio-only formats. Just because we can. So if you want to be able to keep track of it all, remember to go to badgerfeed.com and register to receive notifications. After all, with all of those non-shadow shadow bans, you need notifications from badgerfeed.com to tell you where we're going and what we're doing, and when. If you're still listening to our live streams on the main Honey Badger channel, radio channel, please, that's old news. For live streams, the Badger Live Streams channel is where to be. That's in the name, you know. So if you guys don't know by now, I don't know if I should keep telling you. And last but not least, don't forget to like and share this and other Honey Badger live streams so they'll be seen by others. Think of it as a chance to thumb your nose at the establishment. And speaking of the establishment, I vote we get this party started. Those in favor, speak up.
What? I mean, we can't prevent people from doing whatever we want by withholding sex? That's not what I've been told.
I just have to say the woman who proposed that Democrat women go lysistrata, she was mostly essentially saying Democrat women refuse to have sex with your Democrat boyfriends and husbands, you know, while these Republican men with their Republican wives and girlfriends continue to get laid. So, like, I'm sorry, it just the lysistrata thing has to be all women in consensus. Here is what we want. You can't say, as Democrat women, we're going to punish those Republicans by refusing to have sex with our Democrat boyfriends and husbands. Like,
we probably should have thought this through.
Like, what the fuck is wrong with this woman? I mean,
but she's probably from that school of Democrat women that thinks that the only reason any women are ever Republican is because their husbands or boyfriends make them be Republican. And the only reason any women are independent or libertarian or any other non-Democrat, non-Republican party or outlook is because, you know, we're retarded.
Well, we've already seen the dog be quiet. My female dog named Kevin needs to be quiet. But what we've already seen the outpouring of hostility and recriminations and blame cast on white women voters for the debacle that was supposed to be a blue wave, but there was a guy, the one Democrat on The Five on Fox News said, I was hoping for a blue wave. What I got was purple rain. So we already have feminists blaming white women for Ted Cruz winning his election, for other Republican candidates winning theirs. So, I mean, like, part of me is wondering, like, do these women really think that all women are supposed to vote the same way?
Oh, of course they think that. That shouldn't come as a surprise.
Because if all women are going to vote the same way, if all women did vote the same way, right, in alignment with all the other vaginas, that would actually be probably the best argument to deny women the vote that ever was.
Oh yeah, it would make women a very powerful voting bloc that only acted in its own self-interest ever. And that their self-interest or our self-interest would be presumed to not be in line with the self-interest of men or the interest of men in their children's welfare. I mean, it would be a completely horrible thing for women to say about themselves. Whereas,
well, yeah, no doubt.
The idea that we might come to different conclusions from other women, the fact that we aren't a monolith, would, you know, indicate that women are capable of thinking for themselves. I
That
don't
was the sound of
understand,
me slapping my face.
Yes. I don't understand how they think they can get away with talking as though women are not allowed to think for themselves and not, not expect to be perceived as insulting women with that.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
look at how they behaved last election, right? They were like, "Oh, well, women have a duty to support other women, and that is why you must therefore vote for Hillary Clinton of all
Yeah, there's a
goddamn
special
people."
place in hell for women who don't support other women.
Oh yes, well, feminists are just filled with duty.
Oh God, duty, duty. Not duty, duty.
Of course.
Yeah, the stuff that comes out of my dog's anuses. But essentially, well, and other individuals' anuses as well. But essentially, like what frustrates me about the entire thing is like they just seem to be unwilling to learn their lesson. And like Alison was asking me, how the hell did we lose? How the hell did not we, but the Republicans lose the House? Because and she's asking this question because let's face it, the reason Trump won was because the left keeps playing the identity politics card and the political correctness card and all of this stuff, calling the American voters racist and sexist and Islamophobic and xenophobic and homophobic and all of these things, and saying they're a bunch of deplorables and all. And who knew you can't win an election by telling your voters, the entire voting base, that they're immoral. Who knew that? I didn't. I had no idea that would be a bad idea, but apparently it is. But they didn't learn their lesson, and they've essentially the entire campaign leading up, at least the one that makes it into the national media or the international media, the entire campaign for everybody during these midterms has been Orange Man bad, right? And so it's like, it's not, here's what we're offering you, other than I guess maybe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who won in a landslide, but is, I think, certifiably insane. Other than her, nobody was actually offering a platform. They weren't actually offering a bunch of policies and stuff. They were just essentially saying, you should vote for us because Trump is evil. And I'm sorry, but that essentially tells the American public that, okay, well, all those people who don't necessarily think, they might not like Trump, but they don't think he's evil or a Nazi, and that they, or the people who voted for Trump, like it's telling them that you support evil and therefore you're bad, and nobody wants to hear that. And this is what, you're hurting women and you're hurting minorities and you're hurting this, that, and the other if you don't vote for us. And it's starting to wear really thin with the American public, and I'm hoping with the UK and the Canadian public as well. But so what we have is the situation where they really didn't offer anything other than attacking the other person, the other side. And after the Kavanaugh thing, I mean, like the whole Me Too thing, the Kavanaugh thing, when you look at the polls that they took, maybe late last year, right, and asked the American public, if a man in a position of power is accused of having sexually assaulted or some kind of sexual misconduct that occurred, decades ago, should he lose his job now? And the number of people who said no, he shouldn't lose his job now, has increased since then, not decreased, right? I mean, these are like huge, vast excesses. And the American public is getting sick of them, and yet, what do we hear? On the heels, or after the day after the election results come in, we hear feminists berating white women for not staying loyal to my vagina, and voting for Republican candidates, and we hear the dude who was running in against Ted Cruz, essentially saying, you know, it's a bunch of racists who voted for that guy, and we have the guy in Florida saying that, you know, it's a bunch of racists who voted for the other guy, and we have all of these Democrats who just, they will not learn their lesson.
Yeah.
They will not learn.
Beto
And
O'Rourke
the only-
actually
even-
came out and dropped an F-bomb live because he was pissed off at people for not voting for him.
Oh
Who?
my gosh.
Beta, well, actually, I'm referring to him as Beta, but Beto O'Rourke,
Beto.
the fake
Yeah, yeah.
skateboarding candidate
Yeah,
who rode literally just standing still with his arms out for balance, rode onto stage on his... He didn't even tic-tac! The fucker didn't even tic-tac! I'm a skateboarder! Come on, I can do more than that. And I wasn't a real skateboarder. I was just trying to learn before I hurt myself bad enough that I chickened out of it.
Well, what drives me crazy is, like, Alison saying, well, how did the Republicans lose the House then? And it's because the majority of, like, because urban populations are concentrated in California and New York and places like that, and they have a lot of seats based on population. The Senate is supposed to be the thing that prevents mob rule from prevailing, right? So you have the lower house, right, that is based on population, right? The number of seats in California is 53 versus 2 in Idaho or something like that, right? So, I mean, it's based on population. Then you have the Senate that's supposed to provide a check on mob rule, on the ability of 1 or 2 states like California or New York dictating what happens in the entire rest of the country just because they have the most people, right? And that's an extremely wise way of doing things, because what do people in Los Angeles or New York City know about operating a farm in Iowa? They don't. They don't know anything about it, right? So of course you have that balance, that check there to balance out the power of the tyranny of the majority, right? And prevent less populated densely populated states from being exploited by the more densely populated ones. That's beautiful. But now we have what do we have? We have people saying, Joy Behar and others saying we should get rid of the Senate or revamp the Senate to make it more populist, even though apparently Trump is a populist and everybody hates him. But they want to make it more responsive to the popular vote. They want to, just like after Trump's election, let's get rid of the Electoral College, which is supposed to actually place a check on the tyranny of the majority as well. And they're talking about one of the first orders of business is to impeach Kavanaugh.
Yes.
Right? Like, so we're not gonna fix Obamacare. We're not gonna get that back in the works. We're not going to oppose the wall. We're going to impeach Kavanaugh, and we're going to make Trump hand over his tax returns because we're sure he's a dirty crook, right? Well, and that's the first order of business of the Democrat House after this election. And I'm just like, I'm blown away by it because, like, what do you think tax info is going to prove, right?
It's just going to prove that he's more of a Nazi, obviously.
It's going to prove that he has, that he doesn't do his own taxes, that he hires somebody who's quite clever and well-informed of the tax laws to do his own taxes. That person does what my H&R Block person does, which is try and get me every single deduction possible and ensure that I pay the smallest amount of tax possible and make sure I get put in as many deductibles, file as many deductibles as I can, which I usually don't because I'm lazy, but I should. Okay, and then if something's a little bit wonky, all Trump has to do is say, "Well, I don't do my own taxes. I pay this genius to do it," he either screwed it up or he intentionally, did some shifty stuff. Tell me how. I'm going to put it to an independent team, an independent accounting firm. They're going to find out how much I owe in back taxes. I'm going to pay it. It's all good. Right? Oh, and also, wouldn't it be great if we had a tax system where you didn't have to hire a genius who's like completely on top of all of, why don't we reform these tax laws and make them simpler so that cheaters are more easily caught? Wouldn't that be great? We can get rid of all of this red tape, that I ran on that platform. Let's get rid of all these regulations and all of this other superfluous stuff, and let's make things simpler. And wouldn't that, because, hey, as a billionaire, I can afford to hire this genius. But, the guy running the dry cleaners in Muskogee, Wisconsin, or wherever the fuck, right? He can't afford this guy.
They already kind of did that. Oh God, what's her name? The chick that's always smirking when she thinks that she's said something rotten about Trump. I never actually catch her on the air live. I always catch her in
Rachel
other people's.
Maddow?
Yeah, Maddow. Other people rebroadcast her, and I see that usually. But she had a show where she had her Geraldo Rivera, Al Capone's vault moment with a Trump tax return that was actually stolen. It was wrongfully released, and it turned out there was nothing embarrassing on it, and she tried to make something of basically deductions that are not illegal. And it actually, in the long run, it proved, essentially, that he paid taxes, and that he actually paid more of his taxes than he had to, and more of his taxes than a lot of people on the left pay of theirs. So it really backfired. So I think this, if he did that 1 year, this may be a pattern, of behavior with him. Especially in terms of his, if he's using the same person to do his taxes every year, well, they're probably going to find that with his other tax returns.
I mean, these guys are just way too busy and focused on finding gotchas and things that are terrible with the other side. Yeah. Like they're not creating anything anymore. Like it drives me nuts as somebody who still considers myself like largely politically left to just see the political left just squandering everything away. Because they're not focusing on anything anymore. Like, for Pete's sakes, even Trudeau ran on more than what these guys in the States are doing a lot of the time. Yes, Remy, I know. But yeah, no, it's just, I don't know. It drives me nuts because you can't expect people to vote for you and be like educated voters if you're just going to be like, those guys are terrible on that side.
The whole strategy is don't vote for us, vote against those guys.
Yeah.
Well, there's a degree to which both sides do that, though, and I think that's partly the problem. That's part of the reason why, even though there wasn't a blue wave, there was they did take back the House. They took back the House by like really over the minority. If you count the entire minority and not just the Republican minority, they took over the House by 5 seats. They have a 5-seat majority, if I understand it correctly. So no, part of the problem is the Republicans really kind of whiffed in terms of putting their foot down and strengthening their platforms and strengthening their message and so on. Then they really, they really should have been louder. They really should have been more obnoxious. They really should have been more blatant and open about this is what we are going to do. And they really should have said a lot more about the importance of due process in this election, because that was a major factor. And part of what they did wrong was to engage in the same mud throwing the other side does. I noticed that Ohio pretty much it was red almost all the way across in terms of the major elections and everything, but there was one blue winner, Sherrod Brown. You know, the guy that I said, if he wasn't an opponent of due process himself, I would have voted for him, simply because he was having a false accusation used against him in his election. And, you know, if I felt that way about it, I'm sure I'm not the only one, and I'm sure that there are due process advocates who did not pay attention to his voting history, did not know about his promotion of the Campus Save Act, but did know about the false accusation, who voted for him, and who were disgusted with the mudflinging, and who didn't listen to any other message besides the fact that he was targeted with mudslinging, and like I said, in particular, a false accusation. So we're stuck with him again, and you know, from my angle, as far as I'm concerned, we basically have an opponent of due process in that office to deal with now.
Well, maybe he's not going to be such an opponent of due process after his own experience and Brett Kavanaugh.
The problem is that his experience was decades ago, during his divorce, and it was just brought up again in this election. So he opposed due process after being falsely accused himself. He wants due process in his case, but those other men, those other pleb men, they don't deserve it because they're not him. They're not a senator. And that bothers me, you know.
Yeah.
It just, that this is one of the reasons why, you know, we have this situation. But another reason why we have this situation is that we do have a lot of women who engage in the vagina vote. We have, in certain areas, there are women who voted for candidates because they are the pro-woman party, and apparently the Republicans are the anti-woman party because Trump, right? We have women who voted on issues like, I want free birth control, I want free abortions, things like that.
Seemed like half of the things that they were voting on was just, give me my abortions, yo.
Yeah, and it's essentially women asking for handouts. Now, as far as women's suffrage is concerned, my vote's important to me. My vote's important to me because I like having some control over my life and what people can tell me to do and so on, right? But the fact is, if I didn't have my vote, I wouldn't lose my political power because I'm female and because we live in a very, very gynocentric society. And I have a better opportunity to go to a representative and convince a representative that something should be done or something should not be done on the basis of how it hurts or harms women. And men don't have that as easily to where they could say, well, this will hurt or harm our sex, people of our sex. You know, they would have to have women's agreement and go in and argue this will hurt or harm women and families. And that is a political power that is unique to women. And it is one that outweighs the vote. So you could take away women's suffrage, and women's political power and women's social power would not be reduced significantly at all.
It shouldn't even be about, like, giving women the right to vote or taking away the right to vote, because it's not really about men or women, in my opinion. It's about educated people versus uneducated people, or people who are voting because of an ideology, or people who are voting because of what's between your legs. Like, I can't fathom doing something so stupid. Like, the amount of people who are saying, oh, I hope Hillary Clinton wins just because she's got a vagina, was embarrassing. And the fact that they ran her over, like, I mean, Bernie Sanders, like, say what you will about him. I know that a lot of people are not fans of him for a lot of reasons, but he was sure as shit a better candidate than Hillary Clinton was. But, like, it's just uneducated, stupid people voting for stupid reasons, if you ask me. Not to sound like a total elitist, but, like, geez, like, people voting, okay, yeah, I want to vote for this person because she's a woman. It's like, I want to buy this car because it's red. Like, it's uneducated. Yeah. It's a bad way to do things. And I think that way too many people do vote that way.
The moment that Hillary Clinton said, and I'm going to paraphrase this. She said, "You shouldn't vote for me because I'm a woman. You should vote for me because of my qualifications, one of which is that I'm a woman."
Drives me bonkers.
And I'm like, is part of the role of POTUS like squeezing out babies or breastfeeding or, you know, menstruating? Is that like a qualification for the job? Because, yeah, being a woman is not a qualification for a job like President of the United States. Being a man, if being a man isn't a qualification, then being a woman isn't one. It's just...
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, maybe educated isn't the right word, because I mean, I guess that, like, people are going to have different opinions, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're educated or uneducated, but informed, I think, is the better word. You know, aware of the issues, aware of what's really going on in the world, of what needs to be talked about. Exactly. Like, having reasons for your opinions that you can argue and reasonably debate with somebody else, not just orange man bad or my vagina or something like that.
Well, it definitely helps to be rational. Yes. And honestly, the way feminists claim women got voting rights, if it were true, would have actually been a demonstration that women shouldn't be voting, and it would be a demonstration that women shouldn't hold political office. Because if you look back at what the suffragettes did specifically, like, you had women throwing rocks through store windows, you had women chasing people down on the street, you had women rioting, you had women blocking traffic.
You had women lacing letter boxes with acid. You had women sending caustic materials through the mail to politicians. You had women throwing a hatchet at the Prime Minister of the UK, of
bombing
Britain.
Churches.
And missing him, but hitting the Irish minister with the hatchet. You had
plotting to throw a member of Parliament off a cliff.
Off a cliff, yeah. Well, no, they tried to. They didn't plot to. They tried to.
Well, they plotted and then they tried.
Yeah, but and then you had them setting fire to firebombing train stations. You had them firebombing post offices, burning people's mail. You had them, which, you know, like, people's paychecks could have been in that. Like, that's the mail. Then would be like doing a the kind of hacking, you know, and stealing people's private information and stuff like that. There's a reason why it's illegal to open somebody else's mail, and there's a reason it's illegal for a postal employee to destroy a piece of postage. Just like throw it in a ditch or something like that and not deliver it.
They can't even do that with junk mail.
Yeah, it could be really important. It could be somebody's will. It could be, you know, a check for $1 million. It could be anything, right? It could be notification that your family member has died. So essentially, that's what they were doing back then. They were chaining themselves to various structures. They were, and then the reason why they were force fed when they were actually put in jail, in a special wing constructed just for them, so that they would not have to, because they were all middle and upper class ladies, and it wasn't seemly to have them residing with the plebs in the jail.
Mingling with the general population.
Yeah, so essentially they when they were in jail, they demanded that they be designated as political prisoners. which would have given them certain privileges and would have given them the option to seek asylum in other countries. And the judges said, no, we're not going to do that. You're not political prisoners. You're not in here for your political views. You're in here for firebombing fucking train stations, bitch. And so then they went on a hunger strike to protest the fact that the court was not going to bend the rules for them. And so they were force-fed just like anybody else at that time who went on a hunger strike.
Yep. And you know, you hear from feminists that suffragettes were force-fed as part of the fight for your voting rights. Their being force-fed did not obtain anybody any voting rights.
Yeah, their being force-fed was just because they were throwing a tantrum in jail over not being let off the hook for their terrorist acts.
Exactly. And the fact is, voting rights were expanding at that time anyway. And they had been expanding for quite some time. This was something that had been going on for about a century, a little more than a century. There were
1832, I think, was the first Chartist petition.
Yeah, and there were expansions upon expansions. It was just a little bit at a time. This particular standard, and then that particular standard would be, we don't have to have that standard met anymore. We'll extend voting rights to this group of people, and then to this group of people, and then to all homeowners, and so on.
One of the most interesting things too was that when they actually they relaxed voting rights in, I think it was in the 1860s, to essentially they lowered the amount of property you had to own to include more property owners. And what ended up, this is in the UK, what ended up happening was the government decided if you were a property owner, if you were a payer of property tax. And so landlords they actually took advantage of this because they were like, okay, so I own this property. I can charge you the same rent and make you pay the property tax, and you'll do it so you can get your vote.
You know, one thing that bothers me about what the suffragettes did, and I don't know, maybe I'm alone in this. I somehow don't think that I am, but the people will promote, like feminists will promote what the suffragettes did as this big amazing thing for women's rights. And you know, I just see it as, if they were doing all of these terrible things, like bombing things and all that sort of thing, like, do you expect me to be impressed? Like, if I had to choose between my vote and somebody possibly getting hurt, I would probably give it up if I'm being honest, just because it's like it's not worth it to me for them to do these terrible terrorist acts for just that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I would prefer to win the right to vote in a different way. Like, yeah, like through service would even be better.
Yeah,
even if it's just like community service or something. But like, I feel like it should be on an even playing ground to men. That's what real equality would look like.
Well, and this is what suffragists did. They didn't just do public service. They also they sort of invented the door-to-door campaign. They canvassed neighborhoods, they handed out leaflets, they gave public talks, they didn't block traffic, they didn't engage in terrorist activities. They basically grassroots campaigned for universal voting rights, and it took a long time to get it to happen, but it did. And when it happened, it didn't happen because the suffragettes were violent. It happened because the suffragists demonstrated to the lawmakers of the time that it was wrong and unfair for citizens to not have those voting rights.
Well, there's a huge hidden history of, you know, sort of political shenanigans that most people don't realize about suffrage in the UK, and the Representation of the People Act, right, which brought 5 million men into the franchise, and also brought women over the age of 35 into the franchise. And what that history largely was about, it was about women's objection to, so when they did opinion polling, even publications that were sympathetic to women's suffrage, when they did opinion polling, they found that the majority of women were opposed to women's suffrage, and that, in fact, some of them, according to Hansard, which is the documentation of parliamentary debate and all of that in the UK, one of the MPs said, "Why should we give women suffrage when, you know, over the course of the last 16 years, suffragettes have been able to accumulate 193,000 signatures in favor of women's suffrage, whereas over the last 18 months, anti-suffragette groups have collected the signatures of more than 300,000 women opposing this measure, saying, not only do we not want it, you can't force the vote on us. So why should Parliament comply with this?" And in fact, he mentioned that in some instances, there was a magazine that was sympathetic to women's suffrage, very progressive magazine, that did a poll of households, and they found that 70% of women in these households did not want the vote. And some of these women were so angry with suffragette antics that they chased these the pollsters off their doorsteps, brandishing broomsticks, right? Thinking that they were coming from a suffragette society to collect signatures, right? They're like, "I'm from such and such magazine doing an opinion poll," right? And they thought, these women thought, "You're here to sign me up, you know, on one of your petitions to get women to vote, get out," and would grab their broom and chase them off the doorstep, right? Like, that was how antagonistic things were at the time, and how resented the suffragettes were among a lot of women at that time. On top of that, the suffragettes were, as noted, they were advocating for votes for wealthy white women only. And so what you had was a situation where the Labour Party, and I believe it was the Democratic Party in the UK, were less, the Labour Party was fairly new at that time, they were both less well-funded than many of these suffragette organizations. Even though suffragettes were not very popular in the populist sense at the time, they were well-funded. They had very many generous, well-heeled donors that gave them money to do their thing and do their advocacy. And but the Democrats and the Labour Party were there to represent the working class, and the suffragettes were appealing for votes for women in the middle and upper classes who voted conservative, who were perceived to have voted, they were very conservative and were perceived to have been people who would vote conservative. So it would have been death to those parties. It would have been political suicide. So essentially the Democrats and the Labour Party kept saying to these suffragette organizations, "Okay, we really want to vote for women's suffrage. Can you please give us a bill that will not put a noose around our neck and kill our parties," right? A bill that includes working class men, that includes working class women, that includes everybody. Please, please, please give us that bill. Suffragettes refused to do it, right? So, I mean, there's a lot going on there. And then on top of that, you had I will give Sylvia Pankhurst props for taking a she took a dim view of her mother and her sister's warmongering ways, left the suffragette movement, and went and engaged in community activism and all of that elsewhere. But I will also give a little bit of credit for the warmongering Christabel Pankhurst, the warmongering, white feather bestowing Christabel Pankhurst, because she at least advocated for mandatory war work for women.
Yeah, that was one of the actual reasons why many women said that they did not want the franchise, because they were afraid, right, that they would become eligible for the draft. They were afraid that so it was so associated. They were afraid that they would be forced to fight in wars alongside the men,
or maybe not even fight
really,
in wars,
you know, or at least volunteer for for military service of some sort or another, taken away from their homes, lose control over what work they were going to do, and so on. And I mean, that was a reasonable fear to a degree, in that they should have had some degree of responsibility. The men had that responsibility. The men that were allowed to vote, they had that responsibility. The first men who were given any kind of authority under the monarchy in the UK were knights. What do you think they were knights for in the 13th century? This is
they weren't knighted for writing Beatles songs.
Right. This is from an archive of a timeline of voting history. But in the 13th century, they had 2 knights from each county that were elected by the county courts. Eventually, it was 2 knights plus 2 representatives from the boroughs, and this was the parliamentarian representation, basically. And it was originally considered a burden. This was a job. You get elected to do this, and you have to go and advocate for your county or your borough to the royalty of the time.
Well, this is the idea that you should just get the right to vote. It is kind of a foreign idea, if you ask me. Like, I mean, the fact that you should just get it without
newfangled, for sure.
Well, without like at least having some sort of responsibility to your community, or like doing some community service, or being withholden to your country, right? Like, earn something for your right to be able to participate in the country's politics, be giving back to the country. It should be a mutual relationship, and therefore that, of course, we would want to be propelling our country forward, and we would all be working together in a way that benefits everybody. The idea that we should just have the right to vote for no reason, it doesn't really seem to make sense anyway, because then what are we even doing?
Well, look at the United States, right? And the no taxation without representation. And the tax thing was very, very big in Britain during the suffragette movement as well, right? There were tax resistance societies where women, and at that point, married women's income had been fully emancipated from the administration of their husbands. Their husbands not only had no right to touch it, men still had the requirement to support their wives. That was a legal requirement on men's part, but they could no longer leverage their wives' income or property in order to do that. They weren't allowed to touch it. And not only were they not allowed to touch it, they weren't even allowed to demand documentation of it, because a married woman at that time, after 1885, I think, or something like that, she held her income and her property as if she was unmarried, and was still entitled to all of the benefits of her husband's legal responsibility to support her. So essentially what you had was this situation where what's yours is ours, and what's mine is mine, and what's yours is ours, honey, on the part of women, in the legal sense. And so you had tax resistance societies, and anybody here can Google the names Mark and Elizabeth Wilkes, Wilkes, W-I-L-K-S, and they will find that Mark was a school teacher. His wife, Elizabeth, was a physician, and she was wealthier than he was. He was burdened with the entire job of supporting the household and keeping her in clothes and food and everything that her status would demand. She decided one year that because she was as a favor to him, I guess, because she had no legal obligation to do so, but as a favor to him, she had been paying her own taxes, her own property and income taxes. And one year, in order to support the suffragette cause, she decided to not pay those taxes. And so he, being the person responsible legally to pay her income and property taxes, was brought up before a court, and he was convicted of tax evasion, despite him pleading that, number one, as a school teacher, he could not afford to pay the taxes on his wife's greater property and income. And on top of that, she had refused to provide him with documentation of her property and income to allow him to calculate the taxes owing. So he's put in prison. That was not an excuse.
Now, mind you, he couldn't force her to provide that documentation, because if he attempted to force her to provide that documentation, that would mean the whipping post.
Yeah, that would be domestic violence. That would be domestic abuse, and he would have been punished for that. So he said, he pled to the court, right? I can't afford it, number one, and number two, even if I could afford it, she won't actually tell me give me the information I need to calculate how much I owe. And the court had no mercy on that, right? They put him in prison. And then she went on a speaking tour, or like a media tour, what would be the equivalent of going on, The View and The Talk and, Inside Edition and MSNBC and all of these,
just that back then you had to travel or go on the radio, which also meant traveling.
Yeah, but she went on one of those tours, and she actually essentially suggested to other suffragette women, which she admitted were almost entirely women of property, to follow suit, and that their husbands could be expected to go uncomplaining into prison in the service of a greater good. And so there was this big outcry in the media, about this, because and so essentially the court, between the media, the scandal, right, the controversy in the media, and Mark Wilkes's failing health, they decided to grant him clemency and release him from prison. But he died of his ailments within a few months, and so that's a suffragette for you. That is a suffragette.
Men not only fought and died for their own voting rights, they were forced to die for women's voting rights. It's just an insane history, and for feminists to throw that up as a reason why women should be loyal, or men should be loyal, or feminism should be respected, is it's ludicrous. It's feminism should be held accountable for the sneaky, underhanded, dishonest, violent, vile way that they got women their voting rights, as opposed to the legitimate fight that men had to, the legitimate fight that men had to engage in for a century, even in the United States, for a century, to get their voting rights. And I want to remind everybody, like, we hear about, women couldn't vote in the United States until what was it, 1920, I think, was when the 20th Amendment...
19th.
Yeah, or the 19th Amendment was passed. 1965 was when the Voting Rights Act was passed. 1965 was during the Civil Rights era. 1965 was when it was finally illegal to use all kinds of arbitrary ways to discriminate against the poor and minorities at the polls so that they could not exercise their legal voting rights. 1965 was when black men's voting rights and Native American men's voting rights, Asian men's voting rights, Latino men's voting rights, working men's voting rights. That was when their voting rights were protected. 1965, 45 years after women got the vote.
And I'm sorry, but if I'm going to be asked to be grateful for a group that secured my voting rights for me, right? I'm going to be grateful to the Chartists in the UK, who nobody gets taught in school in the UK about the Chartists, not the way they get taught about the suffragettes. The Chartists were the ones who, from 1832 onward, actually expanded the franchise at cost of life and limb, right? Where men died trying to get those rights with petitions that had millions of signatures on them, right? Delivered to Parliament and kept being told no, right? So those are the people that I'm going to support. The people who were like, yeah, no, first we want to secure voting rights for working class families, those voting rights being exercised by working class men, right? And then we'll continue to expand things in the, so the way of the suffragist mentality, which is let's try and get as much for everybody as we possibly can. And I am going to bring up the fact that the sloganeering that preceded, that was the most prominent in the media and the public discourse preceding the Representation of the People Act in the UK, was not votes for women. It was, if they're fit to fight, they're fit to vote.
Yep. They needed to do that in the United States as well. But 18 and 19, 20-year-old men who were forced to fight in the Vietnam War couldn't vote. 18, 19, 20-year-old men who were forced to fight in World War II couldn't vote. 18, 19, 20-year-old men who were sent to the Korean War, 18, 19, 20-year-old men who were forced to fight in World War I couldn't vote. They didn't have the vote. The vote for those guys was established 1 year before I was born. 47 years ago. Right? Yeah. It's barely old enough to have kids that have reached adulthood, okay? That is where and women were never subject. They have never been subject to the draft in the United States. The draft has existed in different incarnations. It's been on and off, but women have always been exempt. Women 18, 19, 20-year-old got their voting rights when men did at that age. Yeah, the age was lowered because men were being sent to war who couldn't vote for or against the politicians who were sending them to war. But when the age was lowered, it was lowered for both sexes. Yeah. So those men who went and died in those wars earned
or had their limbs blown off and had their limbs blown off, were sent home and still couldn't vote because they weren't old enough.
Or came home with PTSD, or known in the earlier two wars as shell shock. Came home from Vietnam and had people call them baby killers and spit on them in the streets and discriminate against them in the workplace. And even now, people call them names and say horrible things to them. Those men earned my right to vote in my first election that I voted in, because I was under 21 the first time I voted. The men who fought and died in the Revolutionary War, the men who risked everything to make the country I live in a country. And yeah, there were women who stood up for this country. There were women who were involved in that effort. But even then, as much risk as everybody took, the men were the ones who took the greatest risk, because the men were the ones who had to deal with the fact that they might be shot, that they had to fight the war themselves. They're the ones who earned everybody's ability to vote. And as long as it took to get those voting rights, it still goes back to that. I'm going to start the super chats because we have a shitload of them and I haven't read them yet. And they go back to before the show started. So this one takes a little explanation.
Just before
French
you get
honey
back
badger.
to them, it's kind of like just remember, this is a good thing to be talking about this close to Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
Remember what those people died for.
Right. Remember what they died for. Now, but prior to the start of the show, we were prepping for the show, and French Honey Badger popped in to the voice chat, and we said hi and pointed out that he'd be in the voice chat when the show started if he stayed. He said he gave us $5 and says, "I was thrusting my male admin privilege onto you frail, downtrodden women." But we were asking for it. Octavio Brannock, I suppose that sounds Gaelic, or Celtic, so it should be Brannock. Gave us it's like my name. My name is actually we pronounce it Hannah, but it's actually Hannah. At least that's what I've been told. Gave us 5 R's, but I don't know if it's ruples or something else. Democracy is a mistake. All hail Astolfo, the trap god king, my only leader. Yes, but is he gay? Then he gave us another 2 R's and said, "Thank God for porn. If God makes porn, I want to see what that looks like." Albert Nada gave us $5 Canadian and says, "Thanks for trying, Karen. I guess Stephen Crowder isn't interested in my North Country findings. What did you think of what I uncovered?"
Oh, well, I think what you uncovered was extremely interesting and kind of it doesn't really make the ladies involved look very good. It's just another demonstration of how women are equally capable of sexual harassment and sexually humiliating the men around them, and making men feel uncomfortable and all of that, and crossing boundaries and stuff like that. So, I'm kind of a little bit annoyed that he didn't respond, but then again, people at that level don't always answer my emails, so,
Why is it that anytime anything comes up to do with politics, crime and punishment, public life in general, the women involved have a habit of making women look bad? It's embarrassing.
It is.
Yeah. Valeria, I don't know if that's a Daneva or a Daniva, gave us, that would be £2, and says, "Don't wives barely have sex with their men anyway?" I guess that depends on the wife and the man and the situation.
Really not the case for me.
No,
well, I mean, I've heard that like married people actually wind up having more sex on average. So if you're married to a wife that is doing that kind of thing, well, maybe you're just unlucky.
Getting married shouldn't kill your sex life. There are things that can make it hard to have a sex life for a while. Like you have a newborn child, it becomes difficult. Your kid gets old enough to climb out of the crib and come into your room when you weren't expecting it. That can make things awkward. That can make things really awkward, actually. But and then of course, you get a nice break after your kid gets old enough to learn not to just come wandering into your room, but to knock first. Then you get a break from having your sex life interrupted, and then if you work opposite shifts, that can be a problem. If you have health problems, that can be a problem. Back injuries can temporarily make sex impossible until they get better, and so on. So I mean, there's things that happen that screw it up. But if you go your whole marriage and you're not having sex, you're not doing marriage right.
If your wife Dave Foley's you, You know, according to Dave Foley, who was, you know, he's a very prominent sort of celebrity from Canada. He was the lead in the show News Radio. But he said his wife, after they got married, they had sex exactly as many times as they had kids.
Oh my God.
Pretty much. And, you know, so she was just absolutely, you know, not interested and refused, right, you know, every single time until she decided she wanted to have another kid.
I really feel like
we'd be able to start a whole school.
Yeah, then she, yeah. No, I'd be, if I were to go by like one sex equals one baby, I would have populated the earth by now.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I'm guessing the anal would be lawyers and the oral would be politicians.
There you go.
So
very nice.
Yeah.
I feel like that honestly just shouldn't be allowed. And before anybody takes that out of context, I'm not saying that husbands should have the right to rape their wives or anything dumb like that, obviously. But they should have the right to leave, if you ask me. They shouldn't be forced to stay their entire lives in a sexless marriage, because I'm sure that when they made their vows, they were wanting their wife as they are now. And then getting stuck in a sexless marriage, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's like false advertising. It's not fair to ask somebody to commit to a sexless life when that's not what they were having beforehand. It would be the same if, like, you found the one miraculous dude who was like, okay, I'm not going to have sex with my wife anymore after I'm married. Like, I mean, it's probably not likely to happen, but
yeah,
but it does.
It would be the.
But yeah, it does. It does. But, you know, like, essentially what it is, I think that, you know, sex, we have to actually, and one of the things that's really kind of become blurred since marital rape went officially on the books, it was always punishable. It just wasn't called rape. If a man held his wife down, physically restrained her, or assaulted her in order to get sex, he would still, there was still a way to punish him. It just wasn't called rape.
Right, it was a battery charge, just like if he beat her,
or illegal restraint charge, or whatever, right? So essentially, but once marital rape became a thing, it became assumed under the law that sex is not an expectation within marriage, and so
but only from one side. It's still
only for
feminists
women.
fought long and hard to get marital rape on the books as something that husbands do to wives, not as something that either spouse can do to the other. And there was a reason for that. I mean, women have as much of a habit of demanding sex when the guy is not interested or in the mood or whatever, and guilt tripping or using coercive pressure or even physical force, blackmail, but even physical force to get what they want. There's research that shows that women are just as likely, in fact, more
slightly more likely to use physical force
than men.
Physical force.
Women are more sexually violent than men because women can get away with it. So marital rape is on the books as something men do to women, not as something that a spouse can do to the other spouse, regardless of the sex of the spouse. But the fact of the matter is, it's something that either sex can do.
Yeah, but one of the best tricks feminists manage to pull off is if you go on some domestic violence information websites, you will find that denying her sex and denying her affection are considered forms of domestic abuse perpetrated by men against their wives.
Oh my God.
So essentially they've finagled a statutory legal situation where it's impossible for a man to demand sex from his wife, But if his wife demands sex from him, there are domestic violence policies and domestic violence, you know, that are all attached to domestic violence law that will say that he's abusing her if he denies that. If he denies her sex when she demands it. Yep. It is seriously fucking messed up.
Yep.
Seriously messed up. And it really is kind of like that.
Like withholding affection is psychological abuse no matter what sex does it. Forcing a guy to sleep on the couch is psychological abuse. You should never do that. And forcing your wife to sleep on the couch is psychological abuse. You should never do that either. But feminists want to treat it like it's one way. Now, granted, there are certain situations, like when I have really bad asthma problems and I know I'm going to be noisy trying to sleep, like I can't, I'm going to snore and I'm going to cough and hack and wheeze and all night. I will sleep in a different room than my husband because he has to work, he has to sleep, right? But he would never kick me out of the bed for that.
There are times when I have become so angry with the man that I'm currently with. Okay. And, you know, like we actually really have a great relationship and we usually talk these things through and all of that stuff and all of that. But I have my things that I do that drive him crazy. He has his things that he does that drive me crazy. And there are times when I am so angry that I don't want to sleep with him. And when I don't want to sleep with him, he does not sleep on the couch. I sleep on the couch. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's me. He wants to, oh my God, dog, stop throwing around that freaking beef leg. What the hell is wrong with you? Jesus.
See, I'm the person that when I get mad, I take a walk. And I go over the entire conversation in my head, angrily. How dare this come up? How dare this be the thing that was said? You know, blah, blah, blah. And then I start analyzing the shit out of everything, every single stinking little word. And then I figure out what was not communicated properly, what factors haven't been investigated properly or whatever, and whether I need to do a better job explaining something to him or whether I was wrong. Like, the hardest walk back is when I was wrong. I hate admitting when oh God, I would actually rather eat glass, right? but I really, 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 really love my husband. So I can admit to him that I'm wrong when I'm wrong.
Apologizing is really important to keeping a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
And apologizing once.
Well, yeah, you apologize for one thing, right? But you don't apologize for the same thing over and over again. No.
Yeah, you screwed up. You come clean. You apologize once, then it's done. Okay,
and you don't use it as a bargaining chip every 5 years.
Although I will admit, I have yelled at him for being right. Why do you always have to be right? That drives me nuts. Why do you have to be smarter than me?
I've never yelled at my man for that.
Not in all seriousness. Just, you know, I am so frustrated that I didn't get it until you explained it this way, or you predicted this and I didn't. Why do you always have to be right? This, you know, and it's not true. He's not always right, but it feels like it every time he is.
Well, mine just has habits that drive me crazy. I was actually just describing one of them to Alison today. He'll be in the office, I'll be in the living room, I'll be watching a news report or you know, writing something or whatever, and he calls, Karen, and I say, what? And then there's nothing, and I wait sometimes over a minute. I wait, and I'll repeat, what, and then he doesn't answer. So then I unpause the video, and it's like he has this sixth sense. And he's like, she's just unpaused her video. I'm going to yell Karen again. And so then I pause the video again, and I go, what? And no answer, right? And so repeat that up to 10 times.
Oh my God. I would lose my mind.
10 times without getting up and going in there to find out what he wants?
No, if I have to get up, it's going to be to beat him to death, okay? So, So he should be happy that I don't feel the need to get up and see what he wants. Okay, and then finally it's Karen, and I'm like, what? And he says, can you come help me find? Oh, no, never mind. It's in my pocket.
Oh, geez.
Aw.
No, see, I'm the one who can't find things in this house, and it's because I am a slob. I will, like, no, I'm not going to show you guys a picture of my desk. It's embarrassing. But
yeah,
I'm a slob.
Don't.
And in fact, I think it was during the last a couple of after shows ago, I had a spider on my laptop. I've had my laptop open. I actually take it back and forth with me to work, but the spider had made a home in the crack where it closes, in this one little spot. And I was just fawning over how cute it is, but the reality is I haven't dusted or cleaned over here in so long that a spider made a web on my computer. So I'm a slob, and I've talked about that before. So I'm always looking for my there it is. Oh, there it is. I can't find my. Oh, there it is. I've tried that with my $1 million 1,000 times and it hasn't worked. But
I'm a slob too, but I generally know where things are.
Yeah,
See,
I always say
mine
I do.
is like, Karen, where's my? Karen, do you know where my jacket is? And I'm like, when did I wear your jacket? Like,
yeah.
And then he's like, but help me find it. And then I get up and I find it immediately because somehow I know where he leaves his things. The sort of the usual suspects in terms of where he leaves his things. Sometimes for some reason, I know that better than he does. So, yeah.
I generally, though, like I said, I'm the annoying person who can't find anything because I'm you know, I'm a slob. I will fully admit that. I'm a clean slob, but I'm a slob. And like my office and my kitchen look nothing alike. My office is actually a corner in the living room right now, so it's my office. It's a walled off corner. It's walled off with a desk and a couple of chairs.
Nice.
That don't have any other place that we can put them because the apartment's small. But my kitchen is clean because we eat the food from in there, and I'm a little bit of a germaphobe, just a little, not a lot. So yeah, I drive him nuts with that. I guess we have our roles reversed, but you know, it's been legally established in a courtroom within the state of Ohio that my husband is a lesbian. So I guess that makes me the butch. But in any case, we will go on with the next. We have this all came from Don't Wives Barely Have Sex with Their Men Anyway.
I know, right?
Well, if you spell it a different way, it's true. And Le French says it's my office. There are many of them like it. God, I hope not. But this one's mine. So Cyberberserk gave us sex. He gave us 50 sex and said, "The pimp hand of feminism strikes again." I feel like somehow that's BDSM.
Yes. No, it's essentially Jamel, whoever the fuck her name is, berating white women for voting Republican.
Yes, but
you horrible traitorous vagina havers! How could you have done this to the rest of us vagina havers?
Yes, but we got sex and then we got slapped by the pimp hand.
Yeah,
oh, wow.
Well, you know, sometimes being slapped by the pimp hand kind of turns you on.
There you go.
Anyhow,
it just depends on where the button is and how hard you hit it.
Yeah,
especially
exactly.
when it happens in the presence of sex.
There you go.
But yeah.
Mr. Roboto gave us $5 and said, "The problem is all females are not the same. They're different, just like their male counterpart. Also, culture, upbringing, class, etc." Yeah, feminists have a terrible problem with that. They just do not. The feminism is not allowed to be a monolith, but women have to be a monolith. But feminism is about women, but feminism is not a monolith, but women are a monolith. But you know.
What I find interesting too is that even if you break it down to, you know, class and you know, socioeconomic status and education level and all of that stuff, and you know, even intelligence, right? You know, IQ, or general intelligence, right? G. Even if you break it down that way, right? My sisters and I are quite similar in terms of, I don't know, the household we were raised in, the level of income that we had available to us, the educational opportunities we had available to us, the grades we got, the potential careers we could have had, all very similar, right? And yet one of us is like super lefty, loved Bernie Sanders. The other two of us, and we're arguably the two who are the most different. The one who went and became an MD and then went into the military and lived a life of structure and discipline and raises her kids. She calls my children feral. You know, like she literally describes my children as feral because I just don't supervise them to the degree that she did. And I never have supervised my kids to the degree that she did. Right. We are very similar. And she went and got her doctorate and all of that. And she's working at she's fairly high up in the Canadian government, right? And I dropped out of university twice, right? And we are very similar in our political positions. And then the sister, who is more similar to the other sister, who went and got a university degree and she worked hard and all of that stuff. And she's the Bernie Sanders supporter. Right. She's the one who's like, yeah, education should be free. Everything should be free. Like, prescriptions should be free. Dental care should be free.
Everything should be free. Nothing is free. Nothing is ever free. The government doesn't give people things for free. There is no free. They confiscate money from one group of people and use it to pay for things for another group of people. That's not free.
If you want free dental work for your kids, buy a gun, go to the dentist's office, and then order them to work on your kids' teeth. That's the only way you can get free dental work. Otherwise, somebody's paying for it.
Yeah, 'cause it's still not free because if you do that, you'll get arrested. You pay for it with stolen. It's stolen. But people don't recognize that. I had that discussion with somebody today about, or maybe it was yesterday. I've been up since 4 a.m. so I don't know. Free education. There is no such thing as free education because nobody teaches for free. Nobody does a service for free. Nobody performs labor for free. It's a very rare thing. Once in a while you get volunteers that'll do things to help people out, but it's not a common thing. And if you would expect it all the time, then you would be asking people to starve. And the idea that because the money for a service or goods gets funneled through the government makes it free. The idea that funneling the money for something through the government makes it free is bullshit.
Do you guys
just have a
remember
middleman between your hand and the pockets of the person that you're using the government to pay for it?
Yeah, I feel like most people who talk about things being free are aware of the fact that it comes from taxes, but I mean, like, God knows I am, but then again, I don't say free healthcare, things like that. It's socialized healthcare.
It's free for the user, but but it's not free for the user because it's free for some users because some users don't pay any taxes at all, right? And so, Hannah, you must remember the woolly bumblebee, Christina Hansen.
Do I have to?
Okay. Oh, God, this was hilarious, right? Because I remember when I wrote that giant blog post about her, and my dog is doing something really obnoxious right now, and I'm going to squirt her with water until she stops.
Can we do that with feminists?
Yeah, she literally was throwing she has had these 2 big beef bones, and she was throwing them around the living room, making all kinds of really bad noise and almost breaking the floorboards. And then they slid underneath the bench, and now she's trying to get them out from there. and I'm not feeling any sympathy for her. But anyway, so Christina Hansen, I wrote a blog post about her that was entitled something like, I didn't want to do this, but, right, just absolutely ripping a strip off of her for a bunch of things. There was a whole bunch of drama and stuff, right? And I essentially said that because she had always been bragging that she has like 4 university degrees, right? She has 5 kids. She collects child support from the kids' father, and she essentially exists on welfare other than that, right? And I said, I'm so happy that my money has gone to pay for this woman's university degrees, which somehow qualify her to sit on her ass, smoke while pregnant, and squeeze out babies on the taxpayer's dime. And she responded to me, and this is the most hilarious part. She was so snotty with it. Ha! Shows what you know. University is pretty much free where I'm from.
See, that's the thing. People don't realize free isn't free. When if you look at the history of income taxes, and just in the United States, because the United States did not have a federal income tax at the beginning. Okay, the federal income tax started. Well, we started with tariffs and excise tax. The federal income tax didn't exist during the time frame that I'm showing right now, which, God, this is so tiny. And there's not really an easy way for me to make it bigger in the screen right now. But this was 1792 is at the very beginning of this. And as you go on here, we have, it goes all the way up to 1912 before we start to see income tax. The income tax is in red. Now I want you to look at this as where it started, right? It has this slow tiny rise, and then it goes way up in the air, and then it comes back down, you know, a little bit, and then all of a sudden here we have the end of the 30s, beginning of the 40s, 42, 44, and it just jumps way the fuck up into, what do we have here? You know, now this is 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%. Now, our income taxes, this is not a full representation, because there are income taxes, federal income taxes. This is as a percentage of GDP. But if you look at this, we significantly increased the size of government. Tax. We significantly increased the size of government as the income tax increased.
Federal income tax was brought in as a temporary
measure, right?
To fund World War I.
Well, no. There was the Civil War. There was income tax at that time as well.
Oh, okay. Well, it was brought in as a temporary measure in Canada to fund World War I, and then it just became permanent because after World War I, I'm going to say it. Women got the vote, and they decided that they were going to get the federal government involved in a lot of things that the federal government hadn't previously been involved in. And so
before the federal government, I was going to say before ours, it was like there's an amendment that allowed for a permanent federal income tax. For us, it was a temporary measure for the American Civil War. But go on.
Well, essentially, you know, and then when my dad when he first immigrated to Canada, and he immigrated from Denmark, and the reason he actually left Denmark and came to Canada was because, please pardon while I squirt my dog, was because there's a coyote outside and she really wants out. was because he owed income tax to the Danish government. He was 20 years old, and he already owed 17,000 krona. This was back in the 1950s, I believe. So in income tax, and he didn't want to pay it. So he came to Canada, and he still has his very first tax return, and it was one side of one page. One side of one page was the tax document that he filed to Revenue Canada. And and one of the things that I think, if Trump is found to have evaded taxes through, shady finagling on the part of his accountant, one of the best ways he can make political hay with that is to say, essentially, when you need essentially an idiot savant tax accountant to even understand the rules, right? And you got to pay them a huge amount of money to do your taxes, and you have no understanding of what they're doing because the tax system is completely incomprehensible to the average person. That benefits people like me who are billionaires. It really doesn't help the middle class. It really doesn't help the working class, and it really doesn't help small business. Why don't we simplify the tax system? Because not only would it make everybody's lives easier, particularly people in the who are not in the top 1 or 10 or 20%, but it would also make it easier to catch cheaters. It would make it easier it would make it cheaper. We would have to pay fewer people at the IRS, right? Because one of the things that was really hilarious, because I pay somebody to do my taxes because of the fact that I don't work a standard job. I have income coming in from other things, right? And so I pay somebody to do the taxes, and I have income coming in from the US. So I pay somebody to do my taxes, and I have to file jointly with my common law husband. And so I pay her to do those. And the last year, he got a tax return of $8,000 or something like that. And then a few months later, we get a little note, a little thing in the mail from Revenue Canada saying, we assessed your tax return, what you filed, and we've discovered we owe you $11 more than you claimed, right? And so they sent us a check for $11. Now, how much because I know I paid my tax person $250 to compile our taxes and file them. Tax return and file it. So how much did they pay somebody at Revenue Canada to look over all of that? And
for
then
a government job? Through the nose.
Yeah.
Through the nose.
And find that $11, right? So wouldn't it be nice if we could all file our taxes on one side of one page, and Revenue Canada would not have to have so many incredibly knowledgeable and educated tax accountants who are up on all of the most recent tax laws, right? Wouldn't it be great if they didn't have to actually double check everything, pay somebody to double check everything?
Well, you realize what's going on there,
right?
You realize what's going on there is that politicians are of a certain class of wealth most of the time. They're not usually, plebs. They're not usually coming out of jobs at gas stations or as construction workers and becoming representatives at the federal level, right? So the tax code is complicated because it provides either the politicians themselves or the people they make their money on ways to get out of paying their taxes, while holding people like you and me to account for our taxes.
Because we don't have access
Right.
We can't pay for somebody to find us every single deduction possible.
Oh, it's not just that. The deductions themselves are designed to facilitate people at the higher income level, certain types of higher income specifically, not having to pay as much. And I mean, that's the way it is. There's nothing nice about it. It is something that has been created over time through lobbying and other pressures that, allow people who have old money especially to avoid paying very much in taxes at all. And that's why you see people like the Kennedys. It's why you see people like the wealthiest of the wealthy congressmen, the wealthiest of the wealthy in business, that their taxes are high, but they have so many deductions that they don't necessarily pay them. But there's still the fact that more than half the taxes are paid by something like 1% of the population. Most of the tax burden falls on a very small set of the population, and there's a very large set of the population that's just too poor to owe taxes because of the bottom end deductions. And that was basically set up to keep people from getting pissed off and fighting back against the tax system. So you have it at both ends there. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why so many people have heard such vehement arguments against, say, a flat tax system or a narrowly tiered, far lower percentage tax system with zero deductions or very, very few deductions, because then people would have fewer ways to get out of paying their taxes. It would be easier for them to know exactly what they were paying, especially if it wasn't, deducted from your paycheck, and so on. And it's a lot easier, especially with women who either work part-time and they're not breadwinners for their family, women who don't have jobs, women who, like, their income is gravy in terms of their family's needs, or their income doesn't go toward their family, it's just their fun money. To look at, well, yeah, they're taking a quarter of my paycheck, but it's no big deal. When that paycheck has to go to support a whole family, when you're looking at, they just took a week's worth of groceries out of my paycheck, it's a different deal. And you look at those deductions and they are annoying, they are upsetting. If you had to pay all of it at the end of the year, you would be much more likely to revolt against the system one way or another. And this is one of the reasons why, back to the women's suffrage thing, one of the reasons why women's suffrage sort of has allowed government to grow the way it has. Male voters are more likely to look at, this is what the government wants to make me accountable for. This is what the government wants to take from me. This is what the government wants to do to me. This is what the government wants to take from my family. This is what the government wants to do to my family. This is the way in which the government will restrict my family. Female voters look at, this is what I'm getting from the government. And they don't think of it as, this is how the government is hurting the employer that pays my breadwinning paycheck for my family, if they're not breadwinners. They don't look at it as, this is how the government is going to cause my employer to reduce my hours, if a reduction of their hours isn't really going to matter that much. They don't look at the restrictions as a big deal if they're not the ones on whom the limitations are going to be a burden. So this is what we get with women becoming a not necessarily a voting bloc, but a voting force. This increase here in how much our government relies on taxes and how much tax our government spends on stupid stuff. This red here that is what we get with women as a large mass of voters without being equally accountable and equally responsible in society to the way men are.
Well, one of the things that I want to draw attention to too is that it's not just the amount of spending. It's what has been pulled under the rubric of the federal government. You know, like before women's suffrage, there was no federal Department of Education. There was, you know, like the federal government was seen, at least in the United States, right? The federal government was seen as a coalitional government that was to deal with interstate matters and out of state matters. So essentially, national defense, interstate infrastructure, interstate trade, and foreign trade, and things like that. It was really just it was just there to say to the states, okay, well, here's a set of parameters through which you guys are all going to get along with each other. And here's a set of parameters through which all of us as a union, right, are going to get along with foreign powers, right, foreign countries. And so essentially it was in the purest sense a federal government. But now it's dictating to the states how they have to deal with their education. It has, you know, the Supreme Court has now dictated to the states how they deal with marriage. Marriage has always been, and this is one of the things that people don't understand about the decision, you know, for in favor making gay marriage legal. The SCOTUS decision there is that marriage is a state's responsibility, right? It falls, like, you get married not in the United States, you get married in a state, and you get divorced not in a court of the United States, you get married in a state court, you get divorced in a state court, right? So your divorce is granted by a state court, just like your marriage license is granted by a state body. So the states are in charge of that, just like they're in charge of the delivery of education, right? And so when you have a federal body then dictating how individual states must act within themselves, as opposed to how they must interact with other states, then you're actually expanding the scope of federal government beyond what it was intended to do, which was to essentially provide a way of, and it was, the federal government was supposed to create an infrastructure through which the states could remain autonomous, but work as a cooperative. It was not there to say all states have to have the same rules, have the same laws, have everything the same, right? So, and that's why I think part of the reason why taxes have gone up so high is because we've essentially told our federal government, we want you to take over things that were previously handled at the state level. And whenever you put something, the ultimate decision-making power 8 or 10 levels higher than it used to be, it's going to get more expensive because there's more layers to pay for. And you just end up with more red tape and more people being paid to shuffle papers to the next guy up the chain.
And it's also going to become more standardized, less personalized, and therefore a worse fit for the vast majority of people.
Yeah.
And we've seen that with a lot of government programs, but we're going to go on with the super chats because we could be at the issues with the federal government all night, and we have several super chats left. But this really is one of the big indictments of, this is part of the problem with having a class of voters that doesn't have the responsibilities that led to obtaining voting rights. And one of the solutions to this specific issue is to see more women become at least equal breadwinners in their homes to their husbands, or educated about their husband's breadwinnings. It used to be that budgeting in homes was done through, the family would have a conversation, the parents would have a conversation. They would know how much money is coming in, how much money is going out, where every penny goes, what they have left over, what they need to save up for a rainy day, everything. And the fact that people don't really talk to each other anymore and they don't make those decisions like that anymore, that it's... you're gonna cover this, I'm gonna cover that, or worse, he's gonna bring home his paycheck and support the family, and she's gonna bring her paycheck home and have fun with it. That leads to this kind of outlook where the guy understands necessarily that it's his job to take care of the family, and is going to resent the money being taken out of his check. And the woman doesn't, and doesn't therefore have any concept of the damage that she does when she demands more and more free shit from the government that turns out to not be free. But going on, we have Mr. Roboto. Mr. Roboto gave us another $2 and then another $2 after that. And he says, apparently sex work was legal and revoked by feminists, and then in Germany. The way things are is anything is legal until it becomes illegal. Nothing ever starts out illegal. Everything is legal until there's a law passed that says it's illegal. And I know feminists probably pushed for that. But anywhere that sex work is illegal, it's likely that it was pushed for by women. So, because men generally don't gatekeep, women gatekeep sex.
Well, there are men who have gatekeep sex, right? And like one of the most interesting things was the sort of the history of the condom. It used to be that when condoms were made of sheep intestines, that they would cost a prostitute essentially 2 months earnings to just buy one, and so she would have one, and she would wash it, and even as late as the I'm guessing late 1970s, when my ex was in England, living with relatives for a brief period of time, he said that the area that he was in there were a lot of Jamaicans and a lot of Catholics, and the Catholics all had condoms hanging on the wash line with the clothes. So you would wash and reuse them. But when they began to be able to be mass produced, one of the things that happened was feminists joined forces with fundamentalist Christians to essentially try and outlaw the selling of condoms. Now, fundamentalist Christians, most of whose leaders were probably at least nominal leaders were men, were saying we don't want to encourage degeneracy and we don't want to encourage promiscuity. And that's why they were objecting to the existence of cheap condoms on the open market. But feminists were protesting cheap condoms on the open market because they wanted to keep reproductive decisions, when to have babies, when not to have babies, and with whom to have them, in the hands of women. And so they essentially, their attitude was condoms should not be accessible to men. Previously, most people who owned condoms were prostitutes, and when condoms became affordable for everybody, it became something that men could actually buy and use, and feminists did not like that. They did not want men to have any say in the reproductive process. They wanted that to be in the hands of women, and so they wanted condoms to be only sold to women.
Okay. We also have Octavio Brannock gave us, I still don't know if what currency the R is, but gave us $5 in that currency. and said, "Can you talk about Emily Murphy's The Black Candle?" And I believe Emily Murphy was the one who was anti-Chinese. I think that's what that was about. She was a Canadian women's rights activist. So, I don't know, you guys might know a little more about her.
Emily Murphy was not just a women's rights activist. I mean, she engaged in all kinds of stuff, I think, as far as I can remember, regarding prison reform and other things. So I'm not like 100% up on everything that she did, but I think she was a eugenicist, just like sort of a Margaret Sanger type of person. But don't quote me on that. I'm just going by just little bits and pieces that I've read, and I may even be thinking of somebody else. So, yeah.
I'm
a little in the dark on that one, so yeah, sorry.
Well, so most early feminists were, you know, full on board with the eugenicist movement and all of that. And you know, you see, you know, they were racist. They had ties to the KKK, and you know, and all of those things. So,
according to Google, just the little snippets here I'm getting. It gives Wikipedia entry top, but it says here, in her book The Black Candle, she wrote, "It is hardly credible that the average Chinese peddler has any definite idea in his mind of bringing," let's see if I can find the rest of that, of bringing about the downfall of the white race, his swaying motive being probably that of greed, but in the hands of his superiors he may become a powerful instrument to that end. Becoming powerful instrument to bringing about the downfall of the white race. So she was a bit of a white supremacist there. I also see her having been anti-marijuana. When coming down from under the influence of marijuana, the victims present victims of marijuana. Okay, so you guys that toke, you're all victims of joints or whatever. The most horrible condition imaginable. The victims present the most horrible. They are dispossessed of, their natural and normal willpower, and their mentality is that of idiots. If the drug is indulged to any great extent, it ends in the untimely death of its addict. That was her statement.
Yeah, no. It's actually, like, I was actually listening to a history of the legalization or the history of pot in Canada, and Emily Murphy was instrumental in criminalizing pot in Canada. If it had not been for her, it probably would always have been legal. We didn't have pot in Canada. In fact, we criminalized it. It was in the 1920s or something like that. And on the advice, right, because there was a sort of an international committee gathered on different kinds of drugs and different types of addiction, and what should be considered illegal and what should be a controlled substance, and all of that stuff, right? And so the Canadians we didn't have pot, or at least we had no idea that we had pot. If we had pot, the government didn't know. Right. So it was just kind of thrown in there among cocaine and other things. Right. And morphine and the rest. Right. So essentially, it was a recommendation from the US that pot be criminalized. And Emily Murphy was one of the few people who actually focused on pot and spoke out vigorously against it, and presented all of these horrible symptoms that were attributed to pot based on reefer madness and stuff like that, right? So she was just like really playing on, and she had a lot of cultural cachet and political clout at that point. And so essentially that she's one of the primary reasons why pot was illegal in Canada. And it was 2 decades before the first arrest for pot possession in Canada. After we criminalized it.
So what you're saying
that's how little pot there was in Canada.
So what you're saying is Trudeau is oppressing women by legalizing marijuana.
Yeah, he did something anti-feminist and he doesn't even know it. Feminists, it was feminism that outlawed, that got pot outlawed in Canada.
He reversed the decision of the opinion of the most prominent and famous
of
feminist in Canada.
This is funny. McLean's here. It's MAC Leans .ca, right? Has an article. McLean's, okay, has an article by this is French Michael Petrou, I don't know, Petrou, from 2012, who says in his article after the first paragraph about somebody else, I'm talking about, the title is, Why Does Canada Insist on Honoring a Xenophobic Fascist? I'm talking about Emily Murphy, one of the so-called famous 5 who launched a case seeking to prove that women were persons and could therefore sit in the Senate. Her image in statue form or on murals blights Parliament Hill and several other locales across Canada. This month, Canada announced she would appear on our new e-passport alongside Terry Fox. Murphy might have believed that women were persons, but she wasn't so sure about pretty much anyone who wasn't as lily white as her. Mexicans, Chinese, Greeks, don't even get her started on, quote, Negroes, end quote. She was a racist. So were a lot of people early last century, but as Mark Burry explains in a recent essay, Murphy took her bigotry to strange and creepy extremes. Her 1922 book, The Black Candle, revealed an international conspiracy of non-whites who had banded together to corrupt the purity of the white race with the help of drugs. Known as, quote, the Ring, end quote, this clandestine network was relentlessly working to turn virtuous British Canadians into sex slaves and drug addicts. Murphy's solution to the threat non-whites posed was to deport them. So there you go. That's Canadian suffragette feminism, deporting non-whites and outlawing pot. That's great.
It's absolutely, the whole thing is freaking hilarious, because I mean, like, when we look at these people, you know, as sort of paragons of virtue, and then we have a little bit of a, you know, Margaret Sanger talking about how we need to breed a race of white thoroughbreds, and birth control, right? She was the founder of Planned Parenthood. The whole purpose of birth control in her eyes was to prevent the darkies from reproducing like weeds.
So apparently the title of her book was actually just a reference to Black Dick. It was the inspiration for the Cards Against Humanity card, Big Black Dick.
You know, like, and I can't. I'm not going to say Emily Murphy was all bad. Okay?
No, nobody's all bad or all good, but that was pretty bad.
If I recall, she actually did engage in a huge amount of demanding lobbying for prison reform. So, you know, straightening out, or at least limiting, placing limits on corporal punishment within prisons, and getting proper nutrition into inmates and things like that, right? If I recall, that was part of what she did. I may be attributing it to somebody else.
You mean you may be attributing somebody else's work to her?
Yeah.
That's a possibility. Let me see.
Emily Murphy,
her activism, according to Wikipedia. Let's see. She began to actively organize women's groups where isolated housewives could meet and discuss ideas and plan group projects. began to speak openly and frankly about the disadvantaged and poor living conditions that surrounded their society. She fought for women's rights with respect to finances, I guess, following the unjust experience of an Albertan woman whose husband sold a family farm. The husband then abandoned his wife and children, who were left homeless and penniless.
Oh my goodness, I must be thinking, I'm not seeing anything.
She persuaded the Alberta legislature to pass the Dower Act that would allow a woman legal rights to one-third of her husband's property. Okay, that's...
it's Nellie McClung. It's Nellie McClung.
Yeah.
That did the prison reform.
It wasn't her. So, nope, but that doesn't mean she was all bad, but obviously somebody not being all bad doesn't mean that the bad things they do are not bad.
That's true.
What do they say? Hitler loved dogs, right? Or at least his dog. So it's not bad to love your dog, but everything else he did was horrible. And it's not made any less horrible by the fact that he loved his dog. So anyway, there we have our Godwin's Law for the show. Going on to the next super chat, we have the DCV Titan, who gave us $2 Canadian. I keep wanting to say $2 Californian. That's terrible. $2 Canadian, say, taxes show Orange Man bad. Tyler Preston gave us $5 and said, the far left are incapable of understanding that being an asshole won't make them any friends. Most assholes have that problem.
Yeah, you'd think that they'd... I always thought that they were supposed to be the more empathetic ones. You'd think that they would understand that being an asshole would not win them any friends, but somehow a lot of them seem to be forgetting.
Oh, they're empathetic, but they're empathetic the way sociopaths are empathetic. They know exactly how much they can intimidate people, and they are willing to use that knowledge for their own ends. They have compassion, but they don't have practical compassion. They have self-serving compassion. They want to feel good about what they've done for other people. And how dare you take that away from them by asking their compassion to be more practical. So that's why it's easy for them to justify doing horrible things to people who oppose their ideas, because their ideas are compassionate, goddammit. Xeranx gave us $5 and said, Step 1, provide free birth control. Step 2, provide free abortions. Even the dog says no. Provide free abortions. Step 3, implement licensing to bear offspring. Step 4, government profit. Except for one problem. No. Yeah, one problem. Offspring are what government profit from. Every generation has to be bigger and pay more taxes. That's, like our kids' future incomes are already mortgaged to the U.S. government by its overspending.
Oh, not our kids.
Our grandkids.
Our grandkids.
Their grandkids.
Yeah.
Generations are going to be paying this back.
Unless there's some kind of miracle where, like, some freaking unicorn swoops in on a cloud of orange citrus scented farts and writes everybody's debts off.
No, unicorns fart rainbows.
But they're citrus scented rainbows. But essentially, like, what we have is a situation where and I've tried not to be a burden on the tax system my entire life, right? Like I even programs that I qualify for, I don't take advantage of. I could have gotten free dental for my kids. I could have gotten free, this, free that, free hockey, or subsidized hockey for one of my boys, whatever, right?
All that stuff, but yeah, it's not free.
Because I've always been low income, right? And it would have been free to me,
right?
But I've never taken advantage of that. I've sort of just done. I take advantage of the things that are automatic, right? Like the child tax benefit and things like that, right? That just come automatically when you pay your taxes, or the GST rebates and stuff like that. but never applied for any kind of extra money, other than a 6-week period when I went on EI and it wasn't enough to live on, and I went for a welfare top-up. So, but essentially, my kids are inheriting a debt. I might be able to leave them money in the private property sense when I'm gone, but the debt that they're inheriting is a debt that I did everything I could to not create for them. But other people who just don't have any idea of how much things cost. And the more you provide entitlements, the more you provide things for free to people, for the user, for free for the user, right, the less people are aware of how much it actually costs. I mean, like, most people don't realize that the cost of a doctor, just a general doctor visit in Canada, is something like $80. It's $80. That doctor is collecting $80 for the 5 or 10 minutes he spends with you, right? And I'm not begrudging him that money, because he's paying for a staff of nurses and technicians and receptionists and overhead and the building and, you know, all of that, and malpractice insurance and his expertise and all of those things, right? He's
and expertise is worth money. Otherwise, it would be okay to go down the street to a convenience store and have the cashier diagnose you and prescribe your medication. Or diagnose yourself and prescribe the medication yourself. But all of this, you know, all of this is once again, we have that issue of people voting for these programs because they want them without recognizing that they're forcing their employers who are being more heavily taxed than they are, their bread and butter, their goose that laid the golden egg, to pay for them. Right?
Don't let people prescribe their own medication.
That's what, you know.
What's different in Canada, though, is that we have been used to universal health care for quite a while. So we're different from you guys in the United States. Yeah. We don't have to. I mean, there were only 2 provinces as of the time that I became an adult.
Okay, but we don't have time for a discussion on that. We're at 2 hours and 15 minutes. So we still have super chats. So I've got 2 super chats that are very similar here. The DCV Titan gave us another $5 Canadian and said, remove citizenship by birth for everybody. Service guarantees citizenship. And then Altair, very sorry about that. Altair Mawat gave us, I believe that's from New Zealand. It says NZ $2 and said service guarantees citizenship / suffrage. And, you know, I'm not gonna either object or agree to that. It's something that I haven't considered, and I would actually have to do some thinking on it before sort of deciding how I think about that. And it's not something I would want to actually decide on without some serious thought. I do think, though, that it is absolutely reprehensible that in my country and pretty much every other country that was part of the British Empire, service was required for suffrage for men, but not for women. Men's service won women's suffrage. Women did nothing but throw a temper tantrum to get that suffrage. That is reprehensible, and there is no way to go back and fix that. The only thing that women can do now is recognize the gift that we have been given and be more responsible with it. And that's what I will push for, because I sincerely doubt that we will persuade the general public to do what you're suggesting. Whether it's a good idea or not, which I'm not agreeing or disagreeing regarding whether it's a good idea or not. I'm simply pointing out that I don't think it's feasible to expect it to happen. So the more practical argument is, what can we do? And that's it, is to push for women to be accountable. Accountability is really going to be the only key to the future to a successful future. And I want to point out, because we've got, what is it, Gray Kainos in chat says, haven't heard the term suffragist before. That's because they don't teach about them in school. They teach about the suffragettes. They don't teach so much about the movement for universal suffrage.
Ask him if he's heard about the term Chartists.
Yeah, probably not.
Because the Chartists were not just asking for suffrage for everybody, or for every household. They were also, regardless of class, they were also asking for huge sweeping changes to the democratic process, like secret ballots, which would prevent employers from holding their employees' ballots to ransom. So employers could actually order, say, if you don't vote the way I want you to, I'm going to fire you. So they wanted that. They also wanted people in public office, particularly members of parliament, to be paid. They wanted it to be a paid position because they wanted working class people and middle class people to be able to aspire to that, because up until that point, the only people, it was an unpaid position, so the only people who were going to do it were people who were from the moneyed class, people who were from old money, who didn't have to work for their money. They were essentially the top. They were the George Soroses of their time. They didn't work hard. They worked smart. They paid somebody to invest the money that they already had to earn more money. And they did not actually have a job. And so the only people who could actually go and run for parliament were people who were financially independent and wealthy enough to be able to not be taking a wage.
And the first members of parliament literally were knights. It's in the 13th century. From the 13th century, 2 knights are elected from each county by the county courts, not by the people, but by the county courts. Soon after, they are joined by 2 representatives from the boroughs. So that was the beginning of Parliament. In 1430, it changed so that owners of freehold land worth over 40 shillings a year, which would have been a lot back then, could vote in the county elections. Then it goes on. 1542, Wales is now represented. 1707, Scotland is now represented. 1800, Ireland is now represented in Parliament. 1430 to 1832. So this over that whole time span, some monarchs extended the franchise in some boroughs in attempts to influence the makeup of Parliament. Qualification of the vote is often arbitrary during this time. However, it was the male head of household that was eligible to vote. In others, it's restricted to those that own property or pay local taxes. Around 1 in 5 adult men can vote by 1932. So that's where they were back then. And then now, there were some places where women could vote. You had to be able to prove that you owned that property and you could pay those taxes. There were fees for voting. Right, it depended on the borough. It was because the monarch wanted to influence the makeup of Parliament. So if they felt they could get women to vote for the person they wanted, that's who they put in. And it goes on like that. 1867, Second Reform Act extends the franchise. 1872, secret ballot is introduced. 1884, Third Reform Act equalizes voting restrictions between counties and boroughs. So they finally made it somewhat standardized. That by that time, they started to have more and more men could vote. And then 1918 was the Representation of the People Act, gives the vote to just about everybody. And in that same year, in February, they got the right to vote. In November, women got the right to be members of parliament. And then in 28, they lowered the voting age for women to 21. In 69, the voting age for both men and women is lowered to 18.
You have to realize, too, though, that the reason why the voting age for men was 21 and the voting age for women was 35 was because of the fact that
men had responsibilities.
No, it was because of the fact that over 1 million men had been killed in World War I in Britain, and the government said, if we allow an equal number, if we allow women aged at age 21, like men, to vote, what we're going to have is 2/3 of the electorate being women.
Yeah. Yep, that is true.
So, yeah.
So there's your voting rights. Then Tyler Preston gives us $2 and says, so the suffragettes were made out of Naomi Wolf's.
Yeah, they were.
Yep.
They were. Men are horrible, and we hate them, and we want them to go to jail on our behalf. And give us the right to vote. Suck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Feminism. This is something that I have to repeat. Feminists have never accomplished anything without demanding that men give it to them. They have never done anything on their own. They've only ever agitated for men to fix, in their eyes, conditions that they were dissatisfied with. That's all they have ever done. Even now, even when they're demanding that birth control be paid for through the government by the taxpayers, they are demanding money from men. Men pay the vast majority of taxes.
Yeah.
So feminists never accomplished anything without men, but they still hate them.
Even the suffragettes in the UK admitted that they admitted that they had a majority in Parliament in favor of women's suffrage as far back as like 1895. So the men in Parliament were in favor of women's suffrage as far back as 1895. It was John Stuart Mill who introduced the idea in 1865, right? But the suffragettes could never introduce a bill that was satisfactory to the parties that represented the working class, right? Because the parties that represented the working class were representing working class families, and the suffragettes only wanted votes for wealthy white women.
Yep. Albert Nada gave us $5 Canadian and said, even with a kid, you could still give your guy some hand release. It's not so much the act as it is the just physical affection. And there's a lot of things you can do. But when we brought up sex, I was thinking of actual like sex.
But like having children is definitely no excuse to withdraw affection from your spouse.
No, not affection.
Ridiculous.
No, but it does. But, it does change. It changes things a lot as far as what logistics are.
I'm gonna tell a very brief funny story from after I had my first.
Make it very brief because we're at 2.5 hours now.
My parents were staying in a hotel. We were living quite far away from the rest of my family. I had my first kid. And my parents came, and they were coming to just hang out in the house with us. And my mom was like, we probably should have phoned, and we should definitely knock. And no, my dad was, we should definitely knock. And my mom said, why? And my dad said, because they might be having sex. And my mom said she just had a baby like a week ago. And he said, I didn't notice that her lips were chapped.
Wow. Damn.
Oh, boy. And with that, we will go on. Daniel Patterson gave us $5 and says, can Karen impersonate Big Red for me?
Anyway!
Oh my god.
I just traumatized my dog.
Yep, see, there you go. Big Red traumatizes puppies. Hokibukisa gave us $4.99 and said, OMFG, if we could end all free shit, so much would be fixed. And yeah, that's true. Since it's not free. The DCV Titan gave us $5 Canadian and said there's 201 people in chat and only 12 likes/dislikes. Clang, clang, shame. Clang, clang, shame. So everybody smash that like button to satisfy our Titan. And also it'll make me very happy. I might even sing again. Just kidding. Exploding Pretty gave us $5 and said, I send super chats for attention, dude. Well, that's your attention for the day.
Attention.
We will focus our attention on Exploding Pretty. And what is that? A penguin? Oh. I'm looking at the super chat thingy. Everything is a thingy if I don't think of the word right. But it looks like the pretty. It looks like a penguin in the back room there. Oh geez, and I waited too long. We got another super chat. But the DCV Titan gave us $5 Canadian and said, if you rub a unicorn's horn, you'll get a magical unicorn mayonnaise.
It's rainbow colored.
There we go. The Spencer Fencer gave us $5 and said World War I sounds like Rwanda now. Men died in the Rwandan genocide and now it's 1-4 men to women. Women are now the majority government. Feminist victory. Victory! Feminist victory. Well, the only problem is the feminist, real feminist victory would be if it was 1 woman to 4 men and all 4 of the men were enslaved, and the woman could just take her pick and have sex with whoever she wanted to at any given time, and the one that she wanted to get pregnant by would be the only one that would be allowed to finish. That's a feminist victory. That's what basically the kind of thing they go for, and she can accuse the other 3 of rape anytime she wants. That's feminism. A situation where there's not enough men to do all the work, that creates the environment the feminists claim they want, but when they get stuck with it, they get upset every time. So there you have it. The situation that we are in today financially with our governments, respectively in the US and Canada and the UK, with our debts, with our oversized programs, with our government officials trying to figure out, I believe in the UK they call them austerity laws, but essentially it's welfare reform, and all of those are all pretty much due to the fact that when women got the vote, all they got was the vote. They didn't get the accountability, they didn't get the responsibilities, they didn't get the awareness that those responsibilities bring with them that men had prior to obtaining the vote. Men for centuries had those responsibilities and that awareness without even having the vote. And by the time they were allowed to vote, they had that nailed down. They understood what they were dealing with when they would vote for or against a particular initiative. And when they asked the government to spend money, where that money was going to come from. Now we have men raised by single mothers who grew up basically sucking from the government teat and have no idea, none really, where that money comes from and what damage is done to the economy when they ask for more. So it's a lot of changes that need to be made, and we'll probably never see the franchise change. I doubt, I should say change in the reverse. I mean, they're right now in the United States, they're arguing to extend the vote to 16-year-olds.
They're also arguing to extend the vote to people who are not citizens.
Yeah, and a 16-year-old in the United States cannot drive a car without a legal adult in the car with them. after they've gotten their permit. When I was 16, I could drive. If I got my driver's license at 16, I could have driven. I could have driven clear across the country if I wanted to, and it would not have been illegal. At 17, I had a job, like an actual official job. Like, I was working when I was 15. I had a job when I was 15, but I had a officially hired into, you know, by name, working for this company job at 17, and a driver's license to be able to get to work and back, and I didn't have to have an adult in the car with me. So things have changed dramatically since then. 16-year-olds are less adult than they were when I was 16. But people want to let them vote. But with that going on, and with people wanting to let illegal immigrants, not just immigrants, but illegal immigrants, vote, people who are not citizens of the country, who are here in violation of the laws of the country, wanting them to vote, I doubt that we're going to get rid of votes for women. So women better pick up the slack and start developing some accountability if they want to have a country in which to vote in the future. And with that, I am going to thank everybody for listening. This has been a long one. Alison's going to love the size of this sausage. I'd like to thank my co-hosts for sticking it out this long. Huge thanks to everyone who smashed the like button, to everyone who is behind the scenes at HBR Talk, who makes the show happen. And good night, all.